Hello, I'm John Powell. This oral history program is being recorded on September 15th, 2009 with former State Senator Warren Braun, who is a Democrat from Milwaukee, who won a special election in 1973 and served through 1983. And thanks very much for joining us. And
my pleasure.
Agreeing to give us your reminiscences. Well, first tell us a little about your own background and then how you got into politics.
Well, I was born and raised on a farm up near Eden, Wisconsin, which is near south of Fond du Lac.
Okay.
I went to high school in Fond du Lac and I came to Marquette University. I was a teacher and a coach until I ran for alderman in Milwaukee in the 1960s, 1968. We had campaigners for the Democratic nomination in our basement, eating our food, getting clean for Gene, if you remember that particular time, Gene McCarthy, right? Well, anyway, I won that election, and then I ran for the Senate to fill the term of Wayne Whittle, who became treasurer of the city of Milwaukee, and he had an unexpired term. And I was elected to the Senate one more time. And then in 1980, after the 1980 census, they didn't exactly write me out of a district, although they had to consolidate. But I decided to leave voluntarily, and I ran for Henry Royce's seat in Congress. Jim Moody was with us at that time in the Senate, also ran for it, and he won the primary. And after that, I went to work for the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, where I worked for some 16 years and retired from there in 1999. And towards the end of that period of time, from 95 to 2001, I was on the elected to the Milwaukee School Board.
I want to ask specifically about several of those things.
Okay.
First of all, what did you teach?
History and a little math.
High school?
Yes.
And you coached?
And I coached.
Which?
Football and track primarily, a little bit of everything.
And at what school?
I started out at Waukesha Memorial High School, which is a Catholic high school in Waukesha, and ended up at Pius XI in Milwaukee.
Did that, there's that sports builds character. Having been a coach, I just can't resist asking, did that help your later career?
Oh, I think it did. It helped my early career too, because a lot of my athletes and fellow coaches who wanted my job helped me to get elected to that seat. But I think it did, in a sense. You learned, I guess, that you can be a leader as a coach, but you're usually leading the younger people. But the Army helped me to realize that you could also, I guess, lead in the adult world, and so a lot of those were carryover kinds of things.
So you were in the Army Reserve. I noticed that in your bio.
Right.
Tell us about that. How did that?
Well, I was subject to the draft, although while I was in college. At that time, everybody was drafted, unless you got a deferment. I was deferred while I was in college, and after that I had to either put in my time, 2 years, or took advantage of a special program where you served active duty for 6 months and spent 6 years in the Army Reserve. That's what I did.
And what was any particular specialty? Or
no, I was just a grunt. I was just an infantryman.
No special adventures or deployments?
No, they told us in 1957, when I was taking basic training at Leonard Wood, that we ought to learn how to defend ourselves because we could be landing on the beaches in Lebanon. That was 1957, which wasn't true, of course, but that's what they used to motivate us.
But you never had to land on
Never had to land on a beach, except during the reserves we did storm the beach at Pewaukee Lake.
So how did you decide to run for alderman? Had you been political from an early age? Or?
Well, I always ran for office in high school and things like that, but when I was living near the Milwaukee Freeway in the summer of 1967 was when the civil disturbance occurred in Milwaukee. And after a long series of events, anyway, the National Guard was called in to assist the local chief, who was Harold Breyer, in keeping order in the city. The troops were marshaled at the State Fair Park, which is right across the freeway from my house. And my boys were little, and so they wanted to go up, of course, and see the soldiers, and so we did. And I guess I came home that night and I thought, I'm not sure I want to live in a city where we have to call in the military in order to live together. So that was kind of the germ of the idea, and then that spring, our local alderman came out foursquare in favor of segregation, which of course was one of the problems with the city of Milwaukee at that time. A group of us who were involved in a Christian family movement decided that that wasn't right. So we searched for a candidate to run for alderman against him, and nobody found one. So I said I would run, and that met with a kind of a wave of apathy because I had never run for anything. Anyway, we put together a campaign and raised $1,700, and I won the seat as alderman, and that was my initiation.
He supported legal segregation? Or what was the situation?
Yeah.
But Milwaukee was not legally segregated.
But no one could be after 54.
Yeah.
But he supported the separation of the races and so forth. He came out and said that, so, which was a great help.
Well, Milwaukee was and is segregated, but not
Very
by
much
law.
So. By law, right.
Not by law, so.
Right. He didn't make a distinction between actual and legal, so.
So, did you go door to door?
Oh, yeah. That's how you did it. You went to every door in the district where there was a voter, and at that time you could even go at night because people would open their door, if you can believe that. So I went to every door, and I don't know if you remember Fred Kessler.
Yes.
No, he's still around, as a matter of fact.
Former judge and still,
and
as we
still
speak,
state legislator.
in the legislature.
He once told me, he was the youngest state legislator, he was only 20 when he was elected, so he had to wait to take office till he was 21, I guess.
Wow.
Anyway, he told me that if you want to win an election, you have to contact each voter 6 times, some way. They have to know your name 6 times, either by knocking on the door or having a coffee or literature or radio or something, but they have to hear your name 6 times. So that's what I did. He was right.
Did you use radio?
No.
No. So you had brochures and you just went
That's
door to
just
door?
it, right? Telephone calls.
So you hit every door more than once?
Yeah, twice.
Did you have voter registration list, or you just hit every door?
No, we started out with voter registration list, but it's nonpartisan, so they weren't in use, so I just used the voter list and went to every door.
What was the reaction?
Generally speaking, I was only 33, so I was a young guy, you know, and the incumbent was a lot older. So there was general acceptance of a young candidate, I think, wanting to do this. But I had no credentials, so I had to make them up. You know, I said I was a homeowner and a serviceman, and I forget what else I was going to do.
Well, those were true.
Those were true. I didn't make them up, but I had to get a list of things I was going to do, like improve police protection. Well, you know, everybody says that.
That's easy.
Yeah.
You were for God, motherhood.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
What was the makeup of the district? Was it changing, or?
No, it was pretty much, it was the west side of Milwaukee around County Stadium, as it exists today, and so it was pretty much a blue-collar district, with some areas which were white-collar, I think, farther out near the zoo, but that was it.
So what did you manage to accomplish in the Milwaukee City Council?
Well, the issue in the campaign was a fair housing law. Henry Meyer took the position that it ought to be, he was the mayor, that it ought to be statewide, and it ought not to single out Milwaukee, and it should not even be county-wide, that Milwaukee should not enact a city-only open housing law. And I didn't agree with that, so within about a month or so after that election, and there was a big turnover on the city council, basically on that issue, we passed a city-only fair housing law. And so that was the first thing that we did, and not long after that, there was a burning of draft records in Milwaukee by a group called the Milwaukee 14. Basically, they were religious people who got draft records out of the draft office and burned them outside downtown city of Milwaukee. And they asked what we thought of that. They had a reporter came to City Hall, and I happened to be the only one there. So they asked me, and I said, well, it's an act of civil disobedience, and they have to be prepared to go to jail, but they're very brave people. So that kind of established my reputation as a liberal, fair housing and opposition to the war.
Had you been what we'd call a big liberal, involved in civil rights?
I didn't know that at the time. I didn't know I was. Turned out I was, based on what the perception or the definition of liberal was.
Now, the fair housing ordinance, what did that do? It's still in force?
It's still in force, right? It simply prohibited discrimination in housing, rental, or sales based on race.
And yet Milwaukee is still, we keep hearing, one
Yeah.
of the most segregated
Right.
cities in the country.
Right.
Has it not worked?
No, it hasn't worked. The key element then and the key element today was still jobs. And not so long after that, right in the middle of that, Milwaukee lost, some people say, up to 70,000 jobs in like Alice Chalmers and some of the other places, which would help a family achieve home ownership if they wanted to. And we lost those jobs. So the cheap housing was still in the center city. Those are the people who lost their jobs, and they had to stay there. They were trapped. Economically, they could move any place they wanted to, and that has happened in Milwaukee. But it's only if you could afford it. So it's an economic segregation like it always has been.
So loss of jobs is, which as we record right now, is a tremendous problem throughout the country with the recession in Milwaukee and Janesville and so forth.
Right.
That's hardly new.
No.
This was in, what, the late 60s?
Early 70s, the so-called Rust Belt phenomenon, when all the old industries closed, they couldn't compete, steel mills and so forth, with foreign competition. And we had a lot of that machine tool manufacturing took place in Milwaukee, and these were jobs which a high school graduate could be trained in and could prosper in, send their kids to college. And a lot of those jobs just simply walked away.
Do you still live in the same neighborhood?
Yeah, I do.
Is it still the same?
Yeah.
Still basically a blue-collar neighborhood?
Yeah.
So there has been not very much change in that?
No, we still have a residency law, of course, as you know, and which means that city employees have to live in the city, policemen and firemen and teachers and so forth, and that has prevented a further outflow, I think, of people into the suburbs. But if you take a look at the Milwaukee area, Waukesha County, those areas around there, it's been just a steady flow of middle-class people out of the city into the suburbs, not into the other parts of the city necessarily.
But your district has remained the same, and you
Pretty much.
You've remained in the same district this whole time.
There have been some changes. I mean, it's the same general area. They've redrawn some lines, but it's still pretty much the same. We live in a neighborhood now which is minimally integrated with schools and so forth. There's been a lot of issues around busing and kids in and out, and that still goes on, but we have had some impact on that with charter schools and so forth, but not a whole lot.
So the problems that Milwaukee faces are really the same as when we first ran.
Yeah, there hasn't been a turnaround in Milwaukee. Milwaukee's still struggling, as far as I can tell, in terms of what it's going to be as a city. It's no longer a machine tool city, or they have a lot of factory workers. So how do you become a technological center? How do you become a fiscal center? That type of thing is still going on. We still haven't redefined ourselves.
How would you?
Breweries have all left.
Wait, you have one left.
One left, but that's all.
And the boutique breweries.
That's true. No,
But not
the
the
bigger
same-
ones are all
Not
gone.
the same kind of employment.
No, and they don't employ that many people anymore either.
No. So there seems to be an intractable problem.
I think so. I think so.
But we need cities, don't we?
We do. People are still attracted to cities. I think cities today are becoming more of an attraction, I think, for people trained in business, which is pretty obvious. So how then do you attract and keep those people in the cities? We're becoming a art and cultural center as well. If you look at what's happening in downtown Milwaukee, it's incredible, the number of high-rise condos that are being built. And these attract a clientele which tends to civic events and so forth. So we've become a Summerfest city, a city of festivals with a lot of theaters now, permanent year-round theaters downtown Milwaukee. I've even heard that a lot of the high-rise condos in Milwaukee are being sold to people from Chicago who consider Milwaukee as being up north. So that's where they come in the summertime, and they like the pace of life and so forth.
And there's a rail connection to Chicago.
There is a rail connection. Hopefully a better one will come soon. That's, of course, a contention as well.
You're an advocate of high-speed rail, then?
I think it's the only solution. I mean, if we're going to have a livable city, we can't depend upon traffic, auto traffic, to get people there. They won't take it.
Do you drive around town much?
Not a whole lot.
Try not to?
Not a whole lot, yeah.
So more congested every year.
Well, look at the cost of redoing a major interchange. We did downtown Milwaukee, now we have another one up by the zoo in order to get people across the town and into the town and out of it. But if anyone can tell you who rides the freeway system, the traffic going into and out of Milwaukee is about the same both ways, both times a day. Just as many going out to jobs and whatever as there are coming in.
And you think the residency requirement for public employees is a good thing?
I do.
The unions have been against it.
I know.
Saying this is infringing on Americans' freedom to live where they want to live.
That's right. They always put that in their bargaining package, but it's the first thing to go. Because it's not and then they go to the legislature, they end run to try to get it there, because they can get other things of more value than that. So it's just a bargaining ploy, but I hope the legislature never takes it upon themselves to do it, but that may happen.
I don't know if any other cities do that. Maybe it's not such a big problem with other
I don't know.
areas.
You know,
Well, so you were an alder until you decided to run for the Senate?
right.
Okay, so you were an alder in the city council for quite a while.
Yeah.
What was Chief Harold Breyer and Henry Meyer, the mayor, are now legendary. They weren't exactly political bosses, but they were certainly bosses, weren't they?
Close. Yeah. At least they wanted to be, anyway. Actually, what happened to me personally, once I was an alderman for a couple of terms, was that I became an alderman thinking the city could solve some of its problems. You know, if we just had the will to do it and marshaled the people and educated them and so forth. And yet something happened towards the end of the 60s and the end of the 60s and early 70s, that power was no longer in the cities. It was taken over by the state or the federal government. And so I looked at what was going on. I said, we don't have any power left here. We can't control our finances, etc. So when the opening came to run for the state, I said, well, this is a step into the next level where I think something can happen.
Now, both Meyer and Breyer were essentially office holders for life.
Virtually.
Mayor Meyer couldn't have been defeated,
Right.
probably by any stretch of the imagination, and Breyer had lifetime tenure,
Right.
effectively, that
Right.
had been given to the Milwaukee police chief. That's been changed now. Was that a bad thing?
Absolutely. It was, well, it was one of the things that I did while I was in the legislature that I take the most interest and pride in, if you will, which was establishing state legislation for, actually cities are the first class, but that's just another name for Milwaukee.
Milwaukee is the only city of the first class under state law.
Was to allow the Police and Fire Commission in the city of Milwaukee to set the term limits for the chief. Up to that time they could not do that. He could have either retired or the malfeasance of office, they'd have to kick him out, and that never happened. So we established, gave the Fire and Police Commission the power to do that. They eventually set the term for the chief at 7 years, and it's been working ever since. The most important thing, though, in that was not necessarily to set the term, but to give the Police and Fire Commission the ability to review the rules of the department. Up to that time, those rules were never reviewed. They could not be reviewed. The chief made the rule and enforced them, and nobody reviewed them. Even as far as, for example, a patrolman couldn't take his hat off when he was in the patrol car. That was a rule. And if they did, they were written up and disciplined. And so there was a love-hate relationship between the union and the chief. They loved the chief because he supported the union, but they didn't like his rules, like you had to wear a blue serge suit in the summertime, you know, things like that. So we gave the Police and Fire Commission the ability not only to review, but to rescind rules that the chief would put in place.
It may seem strange today that a police chief was essentially the dictator.
That's right. That's right.
How did that came about many years earlier, I
Right.
guess, before Breyer? Do you know how it came about and why was this?
Well, Milwaukee was like most other cities. They had its corruption, and the police chief was not above corruption. So to clean out that corruption, they kind of extended the powers of the chief beyond that of the Police and Fire Commission. And they had some very strong chiefs in preceding Breyer. And he took that role upon himself to do that. And he was a consummate politician, Harold Breyer, even though he wasn't elected. To see that guy work a room, he put, professional politicians, quote unquote, to shame. I mean, he was everywhere. He established this great loyalty. He had a power base on the South Side where he was from. But the chief thing that, the thing that kept him in power was the 1967 civil disorder. And it was Breyer's city. And even though they brought in the National Guard, Warren Knowles brought in the National Guard to assist, it was still Breyer's chief claim to fame was he put down the riot. And in addition to that, it was Henry Meyer's claim to fame that he put down the riot. That kept them in office for another 2 or 3 terms.
Did Breyer finally die in office, or did they change it beforehand? I don't recall.
No, he retired eventually.
He did.
Yeah,
and Meyer died in office.
No, he was defeated, right, in the primary.
Oh, when was that?
Oh golly. I'll have to look it up.
Okay.
But if you remember, Dennis Conta ran for mayor from Milwaukee. He was a legislator from Milwaukee. And he actually came in first in the primary, he and Breyer. He beat Breyer in the primary. That would be probably
Breyer?
72.
You mean Meyer?
Meyer, rather. Maybe it was the both. It was a Freudian slip. But he actually beat Meyer in the primary, but then Meyer beat him in the general election. And the next time around was when Norquist ran, and he defeated Meyer.
So why did you decide to run for the Senate then?
More could get done in the state, I think, than in the city. I wanted to be there.
Were you recruited, or?
No, it's something I did on my own.
But a special election came up?
Because Wayne Whittle ran and was elected to city treasurer, there was a special election in December of that year to fill his unexpired term, and I ran in that and was elected.
Now, at that time, with Wayne Whittle and Henry Meyer, for that matter, who had been in the state legislature, being elected to citywide office was preferable to them.
Oh, absolutely.
Was that a better job?
Oh, yeah, yeah. It paid more, you were close to home. Yeah.
So,
and it was nonpartisan.
And a nonpartisan.
Supposedly, right.
Technically nonpartisan.
Technically nonpartisan,
in
yeah.
Wisconsin. Have we ever had a local official who really was nonpartisan?
No.
That
no, I don't think so.
Everybody knows that
everybody knows.
It's one way or the other.
Right.
Was there a primary?
No.
For the special election?
No, there was. Oh. I ran as the only Democrat, and there was one Republican.
And the Democrat was tantamount to being elected.
Just
at the
about.
time?
Even though there wasn't a primary, yeah, it was a Democratic district.
I'm surprised there weren't more in the primary.
Don't know. The only guy who ran, he was an engineer, and he told me during one of our few public meetings that he hoped that I won because he didn't want a pay cut.
This was the Republican,
right? He was.
So he'd been recruited as the
fall
guy.
Apparently, right? Yeah. He didn't want to win.
That's kind of strange. But did you do the whole boat though?
Oh, sure.
Door to door and everything.
Oh yeah.
And what was that experience like?
Nobody knew who the state senator was, or what they did, or why they were important. And of course, in a special election, there's not a very high turnout, so you target different people who regularly vote. But being a state senator from Milwaukee was kind of a job that was not high profile, certainly, and nobody knew what you did. So you had to try to bring up what you were going to do, rather than, I guess if people thought if you were younger and you wanted to do it, well, go ahead and do it.
Oh. So what did you promise to do?
Well, be responsible and answer their calls and try to make government work better. That whole litany of things, I didn't tell them that I was going over there to limit Harold Breyer's term, obviously.
But that was it, your back.
That was one of the things I wanted to do, right. That and to expand. I had told people that when I was, one of the other things that I did as an alderman was to set up the first gun law, if you will, or gun ordinance, registration of gun owners when they purchased a weapon. And we put that in at the city level, believe it or not, back in the early 70s. And I promised the aldermen at the time that if they were to enact this law, I would go to Madison to make it statewide. So it was one promise that I had to try to keep, to make the registration of gun ownership, that is looking at so that no felon would be able to buy a gun, to look at that prior to purchase of a handgun. And I did that.
Did the state enact that?
Yes.
So that's what, when you buy a gun at a gun store today, that's where
you do a background check.
Yeah, you sign the thing at that point.
Right.
Which, as we know now, doesn't apply to gun shows or private sales.
Right.
And,
we were naive. We didn't realize that the majority of guns are purchased out of trunks of cars.
And the whole gun control enterprise seems to be going backward as we speak now.
Yeah. The one good thing that came out of that, I was told later, was that there was a local gun fanatic named Jim Fendry, who took it upon himself to fight my ordinance and then to fight the state law. And it elevated him to prominence within the pro-gun movement, and he still is there today, doing all their lobbying and things like that. And he often has thanked me for giving him the chance to become a lobbyist for the...
But you did fulfill one of your promises.
I did.
Well, now, when you say when you went door to door, people didn't know anything about the senator, even who their previous senator had been.
No.
Were you surprised at that?
Yeah, a little bit. But then I realized that I didn't know much about the senator job either. And I had to learn it when I got here.
And were there surprises? What did you find out in terms of actually doing the job?
As I look back, the first thing that I learned was that it was a partisan legislature.
As opposed to
city council, which was not partisan. Even we just had groups here and there, but this was actually partisan. And the Democrats were organized separately from the Republicans, and that I ended up in the Democratic caucus. And I realized more so than at the city that government is a question of numbers. If you have one more than half in the legislature, if you have it, especially if you have that in your caucus, you can pass anything. Caucus was 19, so there you needed 10 in order to pass something in caucus, and then the unit rule applied, so when you got to the floor, everybody voted for what you agreed on in caucus. So that meant that 10 votes was enough to pass a piece of legislation.
10 out of 33.
10 out of 33.
If you're in the majority.
If you're in the majority. And then I realized that most of the things that got to the caucus came out of the committee. And a committee might be 5. And there you only needed 3 to pass something. So if you pass something out of committee to the caucus, the number game would then apply. So I had to learn the number game all over again.
So it was likely if you had 3 in committee and you got it out of committee, then the assumption was that would probably prevail.
Well, you had a presumption at least that the committee knew what they were doing, and that they had looked into this thing, and it was a 3-2 or a 4-1 vote or something, and they knew what they were doing. So the presumption was that they would pass if it got to the floor.
So by the time you got in, the Democrats were in the majority?
Yes.
They had just taken over the majority not that long before.
Not that long before.
Yeah, so you were in the majority the whole time.
Right.
So I have asked people, what was it like to be in the minority party?
I can't tell you.
Just phone in your vote because I don't know.
Don't know.
Were you surprised at the way the Senate worked, or disgruntled, or in any way?
I guess I was just really open to it. I didn't know very much. In the city hall, I didn't know much about city government when I went either, and so I attended all the committee meetings that I could, whether I was on the committee or not, particularly the budget meetings. And I did the same thing down here. I tried to attend as many committee meetings as I could, whether I was on them or not, so I would know what was going on. And I guess I had a kind of reputation as being always there. If you looked around and Braun was in the audience, taking notes or something. And that's kind of what my reputation was, I guess, that I attended a lot of meetings, and I hated them, but I attended them anyway, and learned what was going on.
And there are other aspects of being a representative, though, constituent service, for example.
Yeah.
How big a deal is that? Is that a big part of the job?
It's as big as you want to make it, I think. You have money to hire people to do that. And if you hire good people, and I had the fortunate case to do that, they take care of those and they give you the credit, you know. So it's important, but constituent response was not as important here as it was in the city. Alderman is much more significant.
People, when they have a problem, they're more likely to call their city council.
Right.
Than,
yeah.
Of course, if they don't even know who the state senator is, I guess that makes it obvious.
Right.
People are more likely to know their city council representative.
Oh, absolutely.
Is that, we always hear that Milwaukee is pretty parochial, frankly. That Milwaukee is unto itself and the rest of the state is out there somewhere. Is that true?
Yeah, it's partly true. But it's on both sides. Outstate looks at Milwaukee as being, you know, an island, a state unto itself, the state of Milwaukee. We have often heard that. And then Milwaukee look upon themselves also, I think, as a little different from, they represent people and not, often heard people and not cows, you know, which is unfair, but that's what they say. So yeah, there is some of that. There still is some of that.
I can remember northern legislators, outstate legislators saying, you know, millions for Milwaukee and pennies for Polk.
Pennies for Polk.
Polk County.
Yeah.
Obviously, you didn't see it that way.
We all had a job I think, to fight for the best thing that we could get for our districts, and we recognized that, and we didn't get everything that we wanted. Henry Meyer, if you may remember, had a big campaign before I got over here called revenue sharing, where he felt that the city should be paid on other factors besides just number of people. That it ought to be based on some kind of a poverty index, because there are more poor people here than there are in Green Bay or in Waukesha or wherever. So there's a city aid ought to be based on some other factors of need besides that of numbers of people. So that was in the works. That was a very active program when I was here, was what funds do you give to the revenue sharing program, and how are they distributed, and what do you use to distribute them? What formula do you use?
And how was that changed? Was that changed? And how
it changed so
was
often.
any of that put into the formula?
Oh yes, oh yeah. There were factors of that in. I don't know if we had I can't remember his name. It was from La Crosse. Paul
Offner.
Paul Offner was called Formula Man. He had a T-shirt called Formula Man, and he was. I think he went to school out east somewhere, but anyway, he tinkered with those formulas and tried to, I think, to bring more equity to them. And so we relied on Paul a lot. We had Jerry Kletchka was the chair of the finance committee, and he was very adept at moving the dollars around to within the budget. He and John Norquist, who was the assembly side, did those two. So they were very adept at that. They were more adept at that than I was. My task seemed to be the human services side, the civil rights side, and try to get as much money for that as I could.
Okay, John Norquist, later mayor of Milwaukee, and Jerry Kletchka, later congressman representing Milwaukee, were the co-chairs of joint finance.
That's correct.
That did not please those outstate people who thought Milwaukee was getting too much, right?
That's right. But if you had the votes, if you had 17 votes, he could do almost anything.
It seems a little unusual that you would have two very powerful positions from the same city.
Right. It was very. I mean, they were elected by their their respective caucus people to come there.
And of course, as you mentioned, I can remember those days. In the case of Kletchka and Paul Offner. They really were policy wonks, as the word goes now. So they were kind of deferred to. I mean, if you knowledge is deferred to.
It was hard to argue that their point wasn't valid. They could overwhelm you. Yeah.
Paul Offner, unfortunately, is deceased.
Yes, right.
Now he went on to be, I think, a Health and Human Services.
He did.
Secretary of Ohio or something like that.
Well, he eventually got on the staff of a senator from Moynihan from New York. He was on his staff for a long time. Then I think he was in Ohio, yeah.
What else do you remember from your Senate days?
I mentioned before how partisan it was, but I remember the people who were there, and what stick out in my mind, I guess. Of course, Fred was there.
Fred Risser.
Fred Risser was there, still is. He was president of the Senate. I remember the courtesy on the floor that he extended to whatever party you were at, how you were able to get your point across, to vote and so forth. I remember Bill Bablich, who later on became a Supreme Court Justice, who was the chairman of our caucus, and Tim Cullen, who was in there, and there were people there, I think, whom I respected a great deal on both sides of the aisle. I remember they told me, at least, that at one time the progressive movement in Wisconsin claimed both Carl Thompson and Tiny Krieger, and they were both progressives. And when the progressive movement kind of died and the Democrats began to surface, they had to decide. They both agreed, basically, on the progressive agenda, what party they would join. And one joined the Republicans and one joined the Democrats, because that was the district where they lived. They had a best chance of winning. And yet Tiny Krieger and Carl Thompson were pretty much saw eye to eye on most of the social issues.
Carl Thompson became a Democrat, and for many years represented, I believe, Stoughton. Tiny Krieger, Merrill, Wisconsin,
right.
Way up north. I guess Tiny Krieger today would be called a liberal Republican, but there is no such thing anymore?
Pretty hard to find, or define. Yeah.
Or define. Yeah. Has politics shifted far to the right then, or since then, or become more partisan, or is it maybe not?
It's hard to say whether it's more partisan. I think the partisanship is different. There were people who would never vote for anything if it was a Democrat issue. But you could sit down and talk with them and discuss their point of view. But that means they vote for you, but the rancor wasn't there. I mean, I don't remember ever name calling going on the Senate floor. We may have had our names for people in private, you know, and discussed their foibles, but we didn't do it on the floor. We were pretty tolerant, I think. I had the first two women on the Senate when I was there, who served on the Senate. Maybe they brought some common sense to the procedures, I don't know, but happened to be both Democrats at the time, and then a couple other women came who were Republicans after that. But I think it was more civil than it is today. At least it seems that way. I know one thing that has happened since then is the cost of elections has just, the dollars that you have to raise to run for office. I don't think you can run a Senate campaign for the state Senate today for less than $250,000. It seems that way. Well, I ran it for $1,200.
$1,200
the first time. Well, I had no opponent the second time around. But
second time, you had no opponent the second time.
Right? Yeah. But when I see what Barbara Lichny, for example, had to spend to get elected to the Senate the first time around, it was.
Now that was shortly after you.
Not too long after. It was a very closely contested election. She spent a couple $100,000, and then the stadium tax issue, if you remember. Any senator not from Milwaukee who voted for that was challenged, and the election in Racine cost $250,000 to win for the Republicans and so forth.
That was the recall election.
The recall election, yeah.
The only time that a sitting, I believe, state official has been successfully recalled.
I don't remember any other, not in my time anyway.
There were any others, and that was George Petag.
George Petag.
Because he was the one who changed his vote.
He changed his vote
at 2 in the morning or whatever it was.
So Miller Park could be built.
To vote for the Miller Park.
The tax, the sales tax.
After he promised not to.
After he promised, right.
So even though it was just one vote majority, I think 17-16, in which everybody's the deciding vote, right?
Yeah.
But he was
the one.
He was the one.
He was the target.
The spotlight was.
Right. Well, he had the most vulnerable district, I guess, too. You know, it was claimed by people downstate that we could vote for anything we wanted to from Milwaukee because we were assured of re-election. We had a safe seat. They had a contest. They had a 50-50 split or 49-51 or something, and therefore any little issue could decide the election, etc. And that's true in a couple of places, I think. That probably was true.
Legislators often seem to believe that every vote might be the deciding vote on their re-election.
Yeah.
Very occasionally, it was in this particular case, but that's usually not the case.
Not usually
Are
the case.
legislators paranoid about that?
A little bit.
Maybe they should be.
Yeah. I think that today there seems to be, there's more of a paranoia there because there's so much a publicity on non-essential factors. You know, if you're anti-abortion in a conservative district, that will become the issue rather than anything that you've done or believe in or said or whatever. That becomes the issue. Or if you're the business community, thinks that you're pro-tax or something like that, or anti-gun or whatever it may be. Those issues have more significance today than I think they did back then. You can't write them out in a sense.
And of course, you spent very little money. Do state senate candidates in Milwaukee, for the most, if they have opposition, advertise on radio and television?
Not so much, very much.
That's what adds up.
That's what adds up,
money in
right,
a fairly
yeah.
large market like
Right.
Milwaukee.
No, it probably starts at the congressional level, but unless there's a big issue going. And of course, there's been a consolidation of districts too, and Milwaukee has lost seats in the legislature based on the redistribution of population. So we're not couldn't possibly be as strong as we were back in the 60s and 70s anymore.
Did you have friends across the aisle with Republicans?
Oh, sure. Oh, sure. At least they were, I looked up to them as senior statesmen, you know, like Walter John Chilson, and I would go talk to Tiny on issues and things like that. There were some that didn't seem, you know, that open to talking to you, but a lot of them were.
Think that still continues today, or probably not?
Well, I haven't been over in the legislature for years. It's been 25 years since I've been there, so I don't know personalities today. But I used to love to listen to Cy Bidwell talk. I mean, it was
Republican from Portage.
Republican from Portage. He had a great gift of gab, if not oratory. I mean, but I loved to listen to him talk, and he looked like a senator, you know. And Walter John could, you know, be funny. Really could be funny. Some were not too funny. Even in the Democratic side, they were not too funny. But
so there were some characters.
well, I thought so. You know, I enjoyed all of them. I really did. I'm just trying to understand that. You know, I remember Dave Berger. We were talking about one of the terms for the chief, and I was pretty laid back. I mean, I didn't make a lot of speeches, and I'm not sure I was very good at it anyway. But I remember Dave Berger coming over to me. We both sat in the rear row, from Milwaukee, and he said, "You got to say something on this, or we're going to lose this." And I thought, really? Haven't you counted the numbers? So anyway, I did get up and I did make a speech about kind of an extemporaneous thing about how every other citizen in Wisconsin has a role to play in the selection of their chief, except Milwaukee. And then I'd use that, you know, except Milwaukee, except Milwaukee. We won that vote, I remember. But it wasn't attacking people's belief systems, you know. Maybe it was an easy sell, right? I mean, maybe having a vote in law enforcement is an easy sell in a democracy. I don't know. We won it anyway, whether it was easy or hard. But so there were people like Dave. I remember it was interesting because a lot of the people who were in the Senate when I started out ended up in Congress. It seemed to be the next step, so I wanted to take it too, but I didn't make it. Tim Petri, or Tom Petri, as was in the Senate with me.
Yeah, Thomas Petri, who's still in Congress, Republican from Fond du Lac. His nickname is Tim.
Tim.
But anyway.
And of course, Jim Sensenbrenner was here at that time, and Jim Moody was here at that time,
And Kletchka.
and Jerry Kletchka was here at that time, and I just missed Dave Obey. He had been in the legislature before I got here. There were a lot of frustrations, though. I don't know if you didn't get a chance to interview Carl Thompson, right?
Oh, yes.
Did you? Oh,
sure,
okay.
Several times.
Carl used to get so frustrated, I remember, with Tim Petri, because Tim wouldn't come to the meeting of this Health and Social Services Committee that he and I were on. And Tim would come in with about 6 amendments when the bill got to the floor. Mm-hmm. And he would stand up and say, I know that this won't pass, but I promised I would enter into this amendment anyway, so he'd introduce it, there'd be a second, we'd vote it down, we'd take number 2, do the same thing. And Carl used to get so frustrated with him. I think it was coming over as I came down to this building today. We were at a committee meeting once, and Carl Thompson was chairing the committee as Health and Human Services, and he had a sign-up slip. I suppose they still do today, right? You signed up and you put your address and who you're representing on, and you were called.
Oh, for the people testifying.
For people testifying, yeah. We got to the end, and he had one slip left. And I don't know if he must have been really tired. But he said, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson here? I.W. Wilson, is he here? I looked at it and said, Carl, that's the address of the department.
One West Wilson Street.
And he thought it was somebody wanted to testify. But we kidded him about that mercilessly. I remember I.W. Wilson became kind of the surrogate of all people who testified. But
were there terrible budget problems? I mean, it seems now, talking in 2009, as if the state budget has been one crisis after another every session for... was it then?
No. It was tough. There were tough budgets. We had to try to balance the budget, as you know. But costs kept going up as I was in the legislature, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to run for Congress, because the flow of money under Reagan and elsewhere began to slow down to the state for various health and welfare programs and so forth. So we had problems, but we were in a period of growth during the 60s and 70s. Sales tax was increased. Things went up, of course, like Medicaid and things like that. Always went up every year. But we didn't have the health care explosion that came about
the cost
later.
Explosion.
Didn't come about while we were there. It was still modest enough that you could pay that. And I guess looking back, it was perhaps a hiatus from budget problems. We had problems, but I don't recall them dominating. It was more policy than it was money that dominated at that time.
And Pat Lucy was still governor when you got in.
Yeah.
Now his major reforms had already been done.
Yes.
The merger of the university system and a couple of other things. What's your take on Pat Lucy as the governor? I
wasn't in office very long with Pat as governor.
Yeah, then he went
to the ambassador to Mexico. So I didn't have a whole lot of time to experience him as governor in relation to his relations to the legislature and so forth. But I knew Pat when he was running for office somewhat. Okay, I was always kind of in awe of him and his organization, I guess. I was a good friend of Marty Schreiber, and Marty was the president of the Senate, of course, until he became, for a short period of time, until he became acting governor. That's when the lieutenant governor still presided. Still presided for a while, right? And then we did away with that. I don't have a whole lot of, I have some stories about Pat Lucy, but they're not relevant to his being governor when he was running for office and so forth, coming to Milwaukee. And he thought I had a machine because I was elected to alderman, that I had a machine out there in district. I could deliver X thousands of votes to him, So I played along. I mean, I made believe I had a machine. Remember, he was leaving town one night, coming back to Madison, and we arranged for him to stop at my house for a yard party when he was running for governor. And I was alderman, so I called in all the neighbors, and said, why don't you come over and meet the governor? So we had a very small house and very small backyard. But anyway, he stopped off on his way back to Madison, and I guess maybe from that he thought maybe I had more power than I did.
What did you think of Lee Dreyfus?
I don't know I never knew what to think of him. I mean, he amazed me. The first I heard of Lee Dreyfus was before he was governor. He, the coach that I had worked for was a football coach at Stevens Point. And he told me about their chancellor, who ran around with a red vest, because I guess he took that off Hayakawa or somebody from out west or something during the riots or something. But anyway, my football coach, Pat O'Hanlon, didn't think very much of him. He said he was just puff, you know. And he ran around the campus. But anyway, when he got to be governor, I had nothing, no knowledge of him. They came in my office completely unannounced and sat down, you know, and started to talk about what was going on and about my family. And so I had no idea hardly who this man was except for the red vest, you know. And we shared, you know, Milwaukee acquaintances and so forth. But he was, and even after he was no longer in office, I'd see him in the airport or something, and he'd be going out to make one of his $300,000 speeches. And he would remember me, my name, my wife's name, my family, and you know, he was a phenomenal person. And I remember going to his funeral, you know, and I told his wife, you know, how much I enjoyed talking with him, and I guess everybody did.
And the contrast in style between Dreyfus and Pat Lucey was stark, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Because Pat Lucey always struck me as being the anti-politician, and that he was a shy person, didn't like schmoozing. Was that your...
I never had anything to do with Pat once I was in office in terms of, you know, that I can remember at least being at a political gathering or something. The only time, but he was really a dedicated public servant, Pat Lucey was. And he wanted to do the right things that should be done. Dave Berger and I got together, this was when Pat Lucey was going out, I think, and we decided that we wanted to do something that he wouldn't be paying attention to detail. So we passed a bill, which have actually passed both houses down here, which would give homeowners a tax credit if they improved their home. It would freeze their taxes for the value of the home improvement, so they wouldn't be penalized by keeping up their house. We thought that was a great argument, and we passed it. And he had not yet left office. And he called both of us into his office and read us out, because this was unconstitutional. Because it would give one class of homeowners a violation of the uniformity clause. And we thought, oh, so what? You know, let's do it anyway, you know? So we did pass it, and he vetoed it, I don't remember exactly, but we maybe passed it over his veto. Anyway, it got to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court had hearings on whether or not this bill was constitutional, because it gave this special to homeowners. And it turned out that it was overruled. And he was right, you know. But that's the only time we were read the Riot Act, because we were doing bad policy.
Well, what did he say? I mean, we hear about this with guys like Lucey and Freshman Lyndon Johnson getting the Lyndon treatment. What is the treatment?
Well, it wasn't browbeating. He didn't threaten us or anything. He just questioned our judgment in terms of public policy, that this was wrong. And this is why it's wrong, you know. And he's going to use the full power of his office to defeat it. I mean, it wasn't, you know, it didn't pull any punches. He didn't threaten us or anything. He just said we were wrong. And we were.
He must have been unhappy if you were forcing him to veto a bill that sounds so good.
Oh yeah.
I mean, that's not good politics.
That's not good politics, no. I think that's how it went down. I have to check the record.
Yeah, so how did you guys get kick over the traces like that? I mean,
we had an opportunity. We had an opportunity where things were kind of disarray, because he was leaving and the new guy wasn't there yet, and we weren't sure, so we had all-night sessions and so forth. Everybody was doing it, trying to pass their special legislation because the governor's office couldn't veto it and so forth. So we did it.
But he did veto it.
He did veto it. As far as I can recall, he vetoed it. Anyway, we ended up before the Supreme Court and we didn't make it.
But you say you knew Marty Schreiber.
Yeah, very well.
He was a state senator for many years from Milwaukee, and his father was a member of the city council.
As a matter of fact, he was the president of the city council when I was elected the first time. Yeah.
Well, talk about Schreiber and his father then.
Well, Marty Sr. was my mentor. He taught me almost everything I knew about city government because he went back, although he had started out as a Republican, he went back, you know, like 30 years on the city council and had been through every fight that they ever had there. And a couple of us came through, when we were first elected, we wanted to change some rules so that, you know, young Turks, we wanted to make things work better. And he pulled me aside and he says, listen, Braun, he said, be careful what you enact because someday you may want to use that provision. And he was absolutely right. I mean, we enacted and later on we could have used it, you know. It was kind of today like Massachusetts, you know, changing how you elect your U.S. senator, and now they want to change it back because the situation changed. But Marty was always there. Marty was a member of, Marty Jr. was a member of many boards in Milwaukee that I was a member of, and was always very conscientious about whether it was the library board or whatever it is, about what we were doing, but still very political, very much a Democrat, very much a pro-Milwaukee person.
Now, you were still in office when he was, after he was defeated for governor by Dreyfus,
right.
And he'd become a lobbyist by that time, right? Mm-hmm. Talk about the relation with lobbyists, and especially former office holders and lobbyists.
I never really had any problems with lobbyists in that sense because I had a safe seat. So it wasn't anything they could do, you know, to me or for me that I needed done. So I could afford to be kind of standoffish. But other legislators since that time have spent a great deal of time, and I think the majority of the time that they had spent was on legitimate issues. They often told me, and I think it was true, the purpose of a lobbyist is to educate the legislator. And you come over here green like I did, you need a lot of education. The question is sorting out what they're telling you from what they want you to know and what you should know, and trying to equate those two. Lobbyists
are sometimes denigrated. They're the evil branch of government and this sort of thing. What do you think of that?
They can be. I think they can, you know, they can overstep their bounds and so forth, especially when they go outside the legislature and organize issues or campaigns against what's going on instead of working within the legislature. Maybe that's their expanded function today, is to organize public opinion. When I was here, I would say the majority of them were concentrating on educating legislators on the intricate parts of their business and how this legislation would affect it. And I don't remember ever being pressured, you know, one way or another, threats or anything else, to vote for or against a piece of legislation. They pretty much left me alone.
And so you left the Senate because you ran for Congress.
Right.
Yeah. So you didn't have one of those things where the Senate with a 4-year term, if you can run for something halfway through.
Halfway through, yeah. No, I was out.
You didn't have a free shot.
No.
Well, when you ran for Congress, what happened then? How did that campaign?
Well, Henry Royce had been in Congress from Wisconsin, from Milwaukee, but North Side for, I guess, 30 years, something like that. He declared that he wasn't going to run, and so it was an open seat, you know, for 2 years. So I was going door to door for 2 years running for Henry Royce's seat. There were 10 of us in the Democratic field, so this vote was pretty well split. Jim Moody ended up winning it. Jim was a consummate politician. He just simply identified more voters than the rest of us and contacted them. He used different lists of who had voted and so forth, and with 10 Democrats in the primary, including Mayor Meyer's wife and a couple of others, you know, that he won the primary. That was it. He won the election then.
He had lists that were not available to you?
No, they were available to us. He just had he had a better grasp of what it was going to take to win this election with all these people in it. We thought we could win with maybe 3,000 or 4,000 votes, you know, out of maybe 20,000, 25,000 being cast. Turns out there were double that number of cast, and he knew that was going to happen, and so he contacted more of them.
So how much did you spend on that one?
I spent $75,000 on that election, and I raised all of that money myself. Jim and others, including Fred Kessler, who also ran for Congress at that time, was one of the 10. They spent a lot of their own money on it.
How did you raise the money?
Through fundraisers, things like that. A few contributions of like a couple $100, things like that.
But you held events then?
Oh, we held, you know, spaghetti dinners and boat tours and the whole thing. Yeah.
You can't raise the kind of money you need now.
No, we hired somebody to come in from Washington and tell us a little bit about fundraising, you know, one of these professionals. I remember she said that if you pay me $250,000, we'll win this election for you. Well, that was asking for the moon. I didn't have $250,000, you know, but that's what, I guess a seat today costs $1 million, couple million, depending on where it is.
Do you know how much Jim Moody spent?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I do. He spent over $200,000.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of that then was organizing on the voter lists and things like
voter lists and using some of his own money, and his mother was a terrific campaigner.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Did you have anybody like that?
I had terrific campaigners, but nobody with deep pockets.
So, do you have tremendous regrets? I mean, you must think sometimes, if I'd been elected to Congress?
Sure, you always regret not having a vote, wherever you are. You need a vote. You know, you can talk and things like that, but if you don't have the vote, you know, it doesn't mean a whole lot. So, yeah, a couple times since that time I've regretted that I didn't win, but hey, can't go back.
But you did get another public office, school board.
Yeah, I ran for school board after a while.
1995 to 2001.
Right.
Why did you run Milwaukee School Board? Why did you run?
Which is curious because my whole career had been in private education. I've been a teacher in a private school, and my kids went to private school, and I had, except for, you know, being interested in the school because it's a public entity and we get state money, I didn't have a whole lot going for me, but school board elections are notoriously not very well attended. And I ran for it because I thought maybe I could bring some reason and sense to the deliberations of the board, because at that time it was a circus. I mean, there was factions on the board and they yelled at each other and shouted and things like that. I didn't think they were getting much done. I didn't really know what I could do for the schools, but I thought I would try. And so I ran based on the idea of bringing civility and some kind of openness to the board and kind of calmness to it.
Did you have opposition?
Yeah.
Who did you beat?
I beat a candidate who was put up by the school, the teachers union. They had a difficult choice because I had always received union support any time that I ran. This time they backed another person and they called me in to interview and basically apologized that they couldn't support me, but they had to support my opponent. I still won. There was no primary, so I still won. And
seems unusual. I mean, the teachers union is supposedly invincible.
If they put their heart into it, and I guess they were saying that they weren't going to. They let me know that they probably weren't going to do that.
So what did you accomplish on the board?
Not much. Not much.
No more civility or.
Well, yeah, we did function better as a board, but I was there for 5 years, and we had 5 superintendents during that time. So there was no stability, and I don't think we ever, or the city has ever identified, you know, the real cause of the problems with the schools. And it's not the teachers. We have some great teachers. It's not the administrators. They do what administrators do. You know, they try to make things work smoothly and stay out of the limelight and things like that. We just haven't been able to get people to recognize that the schools in Milwaukee are a priority, either with parents or with the business community or with whatever. The schools are supposed to be there. They're supposed to do their job. And so they kind of take the back burner. The elections are not held during the time when other elections are held. They're held in the spring, you know, in a special election. It just doesn't work.
What would you do if you could? The Milwaukee school system has been dissected and analyzed and considered a failure for so many years. What can be done? I'm
sorry that Howard Fuller didn't stay on the job, Because if the board, if anything is needed in Milwaukee, it is somebody to take the reins of the schools themselves and structure them so that they meet the needs of kids who go there, who don't come from a stable family, who parents don't have a job that they can appoint to, and so forth. And I think Howard could have done that. He left just before I got there. I would have enjoyed working with him, but he went to Marquette and their school.
Was he forced out?
I don't know, maybe he just got frustrated too, I don't know.
Would it take a tremendous amount of money?
To change the school system?
To make the Milwaukee school system work? I mean, there's so many, sometimes it boils down to money, but there have been proposals to divide it up into 3 or 4 or 5 school districts and all sorts of proposals, right? As we speak, the Mayor Barrett and Governor Doyle are talking about taking over by the state taking over the Milwaukee school system. I've
been gone for quite a few years from the school, so internally I don't know what's been going on there. You've had the same superintendent now for about 5 years. I guess I'm kind of a diehard liberal. I don't think the problem is with the school system per se, it is with the community. I mentioned before we lost 70,000 real jobs in Milwaukee during that time, so it's a question of poverty. It's a question of parents not being able to stay together, if you will, and shepherd their kids through the school system and give them some hope in the future. So unless we find a way to solve the economic problem in Milwaukee by the creation of jobs, maybe we have to go back to the CCC or something like that, but kids on the street have to have some hope today if they're going to get a job to help them maybe further themselves. And we have tremendous unemployment rates in Milwaukee, especially among black male youth. I mean, it's over 50 to 60% of unemployment. And so naturally the trend is to go where the money is. And I wish I had an answer. I wish I did. I have some hope that the present federal administration can do something to inspire people to put more time into the schoolroom, into reading, if that's what it takes. But with the computer age today, everybody's at a loss as to how to train kids to function in this next generation. I don't know anything about that.
And of course, housing segregation, which Milwaukee is notorious for, that must contribute to the school problem. It does. They've had the busing for years.
Yeah, that's being phased out now.
The busing is?
All the charter system and the voucher schools and so forth are, we've always recognized that busing was supposedly a stopgap measure, but it turned into have a life of its own. But we have less busing now than we've had in a long time in Milwaukee. Milwaukee is now a majority-minority city, where the schools are now, majority of students there are non-Caucasian. And that makes a difference in terms of how you teach languages and skills. And so I don't know where we're going with the technology in the city schools. How are these kids going to go to college today? What are they going to learn in high school to get there? Who pays the tremendous cost of even public colleges today? And how do they get trained otherwise? What kind of jobs are available? It takes somebody. That's why I think perhaps the mayor taking over or the governor having a hand in it will help, because maybe there's a vision there of a wider community. Whereas the schools are pretty, tunnel vision. This is a school. We'll do our thing here, and how does the community, the bit wider community, come in? Maybe the mayor can bring that. I don't wish it on him, but if he wants to do it, maybe he can find some leaders in the community that will assist.
Of course, he's likely to run for governor.
Well, that's rumored, yeah.
So I don't know if he'll be mayor.
Yeah.
And now the voucher programs were starting up when you were still in. What do you think of the voucher programs?
Oh, I think the jury's out on it. We had, when I was on the school board, we created a lot of charter schools that would use public funds but would have freedom to they're just now getting into a system of evaluation that people will begin to trust. So that's an ongoing issue, whether or not vouchers and charters really help. Do they I don't think they cream students. I don't think there is such a thing in Milwaukee. All the students, you know, that are in great need in Milwaukee. So are they able to help them with the smaller classes and so forth? I don't know. I think the jury's out.
Well, let me wrap up by asking you a double question. What in your career has been perhaps the biggest disappointment and the biggest triumph or joy?
You're leaving out family and things like that, right?
Well,
yeah,
I
the
guess
government sector,
within,
right? Okay.
Within politics and government.
I would have to say that in terms of legislation, okay, the thing that I did that I was most happy to do was to bring a sense of the civil rights movement to the legislature at that time in terms of expanding open housing into the wider state. And that includes, I included in that the legislation dealing with the police department, and that was a necessary thing to do so that people in Milwaukee could have greater faith in their police department and in school. So I pretty much pride myself. I mean, Kyle Thompson once said that if it weren't for the abortion issue, he said I was the most liberal senator in the Senate. And that included him, which is saying quite a lot. Another thing that I'm really happy about had nothing to do with the legislature. I was a football coach at Pius before I left. Every sport had a postseason except football at that time. You know, track and basketball and track, everybody had a postseason. My athletes, who were good athletes, they had no chance to prove themselves, you know, beyond the season, and that was pretty limited. So as I was leaving coaching and going into the aldermanic job, I proposed that we have a postseason playoff. At that time, we had the private schools were separate, Catholics were separate, private were separate, public were separate. I convinced a couple other coaches, and they readily did it, to take this on. They had a playoff among the private schools in the state of Wisconsin, and it was an eight-team, four-game playoff. Ended up at Lambeau Field, the first game. That playoff continued and got to be pretty popular. And then eventually the public school system said, we ought to have a playoff. And then, of course, the public and the private schools joined. So now they have a public school football playoff in the fall. I think they have 5 or 6 divisions that play at Camp Randall on various afternoons or someplace. And I started that.
Oh,
so I think that my disappointment, I guess, was that I didn't do better and wasn't smarter when I ran for Congress. I would have liked to continue my public career, but I was happy to take a job with the church and, in a sense, continued this whole civil rights issue in a different arena.
Yeah, what did you do with the diocese?
I was in charge of their social ministry department, which meant we dealt with all the issues that weren't internal to the church. We dealt with civil rights, we dealt with housing, dealt with labor issues, we dealt with all those that are outside the church walls, in a sense. And I was my job was to, well, I worked directly for the Archbishop, was to inform him about what was going on and to try to see where the church could most effectively organize in terms of its parishes or its societies in terms of supporting this kind of effort. We got involved in the Civil War in Nicaragua. Actually went down there, and the whole business of the Contras and so forth was exciting to be involved at from the church standpoint. The church was involved in that and should have been involved. And other issues like that. I was kind of instrumental, although I didn't do it all. We got the Archbishop came over and addressed the Wisconsin Assembly, a joint session of the Assembly and Senate, on social issues and so forth. So that was a good time.
Do you think that the Bush administration's faith-based initiative is necessary?
No, absolutely not.
Because long before that, you had Catholic social services, the Lutheran social services. The churches have been doing a lot without it.
Yeah. I often argue to them that if you really want to expand your services, you know, if you really want to get involved in elections and so forth, then you got to go whole hog. Give up your tax exemption and go into the battle, you know. But as long as you have your tax exemption, you kind of got a hand and a half tied behind your back because you can't do some things because you're going to lose your tax exemption, et cetera, and et cetera. So I don't think they needed to do that.
I don't know if people are aware that how much that, for instance, Catholic Social Services was doing before this faith-based exemption.
And the churches shy away from an endorsement of a critical political issue. They stay outside the churches per se. Church affiliated, or church groups that self-affiliate with churches are not. They can do anything that they want. But if you're a church corporation in the state of Wisconsin, you cannot do certain things.
You still follow politics closely?
Pretty closely, right? Yeah.
What's your biggest worry today?
Well, I had one which didn't come true. I didn't think that Barack Obama was going to make it through the election, to be honest. There's so many hotheads in this country. I figured somebody'd find a way to do him in. That didn't happen, and I'm happy about that. But with what's going on today, the ferocity of issues today and manufactured issues that's going on, as healthcare is just the latest example. I'm afraid the next couple of years we're going to drift further and further apart as a democratic society, small d, where we get things done in the legislature. It's going to be done in the streets. We've seen that happen in many, many civilizations, and including ours. So I'm just worried about what's going to happen to this country for my children and grandchildren. Will there be a chance to make change at the ballot box, or is it going to be at the way it is now, working out now, at least with the high decibel shouting back and forth?
Would you advise a younger person today to run for office if they want to? Or, or is that...
Well, yeah, sure, I would. No question about it. But I'd urge them, if they go into that they go into it with the idea that it's not going to be a permanent job, that their whole life isn't based on doing what the crowd wants or what you perceive the crowd wants you to do, that you have to keep away from that. You have to make up your own mind based on your own principles and develop those principles first, not after you get in there. And so you're able to say no. That's hard to do sometimes, but I think one of the things that's happening in the legislature, at least just I don't make a study of it, is that a lot of the people who are in the legislature today have worked very hard to get there. They've worked very hard to get there within the narrow confines of legislation or the institution itself. And you can't do that. You have to have some reference point outside, some job that you've done, some experience that you've had. Everybody can't be a Teddy Kennedy and spend your life in public service and not care because you have your own wherewithal, not care what the public thinks. But you have to balance that. You have to balance what lobbyists tell you, you have to balance what the public tells you, you have to balance what the editorials tell you, and you have to be able to keep some semblance of respect for yourself. I think you're not a sellout to the last person in your office.
And obviously you weren't.
I try not to be.
Well, thank you very much for joining us and giving us these insights. I've enjoyed it very much. Former State Senator Warren Braun was a Democrat from Milwaukee, served in the State Senate from 1976 through 1983. Thanks very much.
I wish your project a great success. It's really needed.
Thank you.